When Smart first relaunched itself as a brand, the first car they came out with was rather creatively called the #1, and it set a new precedent for the brand, setting forth not only its new strategy to be a new energy, fully electric company, but also the new design language. And frankly, when they announced the #3 would be a lower, longer, wider version of a new model, I was slightly concerned that it would just end up looking like a bloated #1. However, as we saw with our review of the #1 Pro, we discovered that they are distinctly different cars. And now, with the #3 Brabus, well, if any of these cars are going to have a personality, it's this one. And we've spent the last week trying to find that out. My name is AIMAN ABDULLAH, this is Malaysian Motoring, and this is our review of the Smart #3 Brabus. But of course, nobody's looking at a #3 Brabus in order to talk about the charging speeds or even the practicality. What people really want to know is this car's power stats, which is why the #3 Brabus produces 315 kilowatts of power and 543 Newton meters of torque, which is able to rocket this car from 0 to 100 kilometers an hour in just 3.7 seconds. Now, it is worth pointing out that this car also comes with something called the rocket launch mode, which is essentially their launch mode feature, which allows this car to maximize all-pore traction to allow it the best possible start. Now, aside from that, the #3 Brabus also has a few unique design features. So for example, you will find a slightly more pronounced front lip as well as red accent lighting around the front grille. The Matrix LED headlights, however, are standard across the Brabus and Premium lineups, and so are the wheels, which are 19-inch alloys wrapped in Dunlop SP Sport Max tires, which are certainly good enough for a vehicle like this, although they are a little bit noisy, which we'll touch on a little bit later. And perhaps from this angle is where you can truly appreciate the #3's design, because although it is very reminiscent to what we saw from the #1, it does have its own unique features. For example, the glowing Smart badge now sits on the front fender rather than on the D-pillar. And on top of that, this car's lower, sleeker roofline means that it actually has a better coefficient of drag, making these cars even more efficient. Actually, what I said earlier about this car having a 400 kilometer WLTP range wasn't actually accurate. Because of those aerodynamic efficiencies, including these little breathers on the front, it means that this car can do 415 kilometers on the WLTP cycle, which represents a 15 kilometer increase over the #1 Brabus, which means this car isn't just bigger and more practical, but it's also slightly more efficient. But I think it's actually this angle where the #3 looks its best, because these slightly slimmer tail lights, which are just better looking, they look a little bit more aggressive, to me is very appealing. On top of that, the #3 has very pronounced shoulder lines, which make this car again look a little bit more muscular, a little bit more athletic, and to me, it certainly imbues the #3 with a slightly more dynamic character, at least upon first impression. Now, at the rear of the #3 Brabus specifically, you will find black badging for both the logo as well as the model designation, and down here you'll find a very discreet Brabus logo. You also find this orange strip here, as well as a slightly more aggressive rear diffuser design, again because this is supposed to be the performance variant. This spoiler, however, is also standard on the #3 Premium. Now, if you're wondering about how to get in the boot, there are two methods. You can swing your foot underneath the bumper, which is surprisingly effective, or you can just press the button hidden in the A. Once you do, you will find a pretty decent amount of space back here. Compared to the #1, there is a little bit more space here than you would find in the smaller #1. And as far as I'm concerned, the space back here is enough for you to put cabin-sized luggages, or at least enough baggage for, say, 4 or 5 adults for a longer trip. I have heard of #3 customers using these cars for long distance trips, especially over the holidays, which means that this car is decently practical enough. Now, underneath the boot floor, you will find a little bit of space, just enough for you to hide the charging cables, which I think makes this car seem pretty practical indeed. Especially if you're going back to your hometowns, for example, where you may not have an AC charger available, at least you can stick the emergency charger down here. Now, before we get into the fun stuff, I want to first get onto the basics of this car. Now, the hashtag 3 Brabus shares its battery with the hashtag 3 Premium, which means it's the same 66 kilowatt hour NMC battery, which is capable of powering the Brabus for up to 400 kilometers on a charge, according to the WLTP cycle. Now, in terms of charging, this car can accept up to 150 kilowatts DC, allowing a 10 to 80% charge in less than 30 minutes, as well as a 22 kilowatt AC charging rate, making it one of the fastest charging, at least on AC, within the segment. That means that if you stop at a shopping mall, for example, or perhaps at a hotel, with a 22 kilowatt AC charger, you can charge this car from dead to full in just 3 hours. Now, I know a very good many of you don't like it when we film in this dark car park, but there is very good reason for it. Number one, it's hot as balls outside. And number two, we also want to show off this car's ambient lighting, which we will touch on a little bit later. Now, in terms of the interior design of the hashtag 3, it does seem broadly similar to what we saw from the hashtag 1, at least at first glance, because you have this very large swathe of plastic that kind of goes all around the place in this sort of T-junction type style thing, which separates the passenger from the driver compartment quite clearly. You also have this very high center console, which hides a little bit of cubby storage underneath, as well as a 12-volt socket, which I do think is part of the smart design language, and I appreciate how it's been translated into the hashtag 3. You still get center aircon vents, of course, but in the hashtag 3 they are circles instead of the pillbox style affair, which we still get on either side of the dashboard, which I think again makes this car look a little bit more distinctive. The other thing is actually these seats, because in the hashtag 1 they were two-piece, slightly more conventional looking seats, whereas here they actually have a built-in headrest as well as a sort of center portion here, which makes the car look a little bit more sporty, which I think looks really good. The same goes for the choice of materials, because for example, this plastic portion here is done up in this very nice dark grey material, which again helps to give this car a slightly more sporty feel. The same goes for the seat belts, which are done in red, and you will find even more red in the stitching, as well as the Brabus embossing on the headrest, as well as the stitching on the steering wheel. And the choice of materials also stacks up, because the steering wheel, for example, is wrapped in this microfiber suede-like material. The same goes for the centers of the seats, whereas the sides are done up in leather. The door cards, for example, are also covered in what I suspect is vegan leather, because it doesn't feel very soft. And the same goes for the dash top, which is also done up in black with contrast stitching. All of this again works towards making the hashtag 3 Brabus feel like the performance car that it claims to be, and I think that it does so quite successfully. Now, because it's an electric car, we have to talk about the technology. And so in the middle, we have a center screen, which is the same size as what you get from every other Smart. And in terms of the graphics and the interface, it is as good as you expect it to be. It's very responsive, it's very reactive, and the graphics themselves are also really good. And on top of that, there are lots of really cute animations to things. So for example, when I trigger this car's voice assistant, there's a little cheetah that talks back. If I change the driving mode, for example, you see the little globe in the middle moves around, and you have the corresponding sound effect. And that, to me, really does talk a lot about what this car's character is about and who it's trying to appeal to, because ultimately Smart targets a slightly younger audience compared to brands like, say, Mercedes-Benz or BMW, which means they are into this sort of design language, and I think they've done so pretty well. And of course, in addition to this screen, there is also a small instrument cluster up ahead of me, which gives me all of my pertinent information. And directly in my line of sight is a full color heads-up display, which not only shows me this car's ADAS functionalities, but also gives me my navigational instructions, whether or not I use the built-in navigation or if I use Android Auto, Apple CarPlay, both of which are available wirelessly. Speaking of which, there is a wireless charger up here, a couple of USB-C ports, you get a couple of cup holders here, a little slot to hold your phone. You get a decently sized center armrest, which is also air conditioned, which means that you can keep drinks cool in here over longer journeys, as we proved with the hashtag 1 Pro, and we took that all the way to Penang. There is that space underneath here that I mentioned earlier, as well as a decently sized glove box, which is large enough to hold things like the owner's manual, for example, should you want it, although the owner's manual in this car is digital. You also get relatively large door bins, big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle, as well as a space up here to hold your sunglasses, which is something that I always appreciate. Now, one of the things about this car that I don't quite appreciate is this space here, because this circle has a little Smart logo in the middle of it, which you might think is a pretty good piece of design, and I agree. Except in the hashtag 1, this was where the toggle switch lid for the panoramic sunroof blind. Now this car comes with a one-piece glass roof which looks fantastic, it certainly lets a lot of light into the cabin. Unfortunately, there is no electric sun blind. Now I have moaned about this before and I will moan about it again until car makers actually pay attention. The problem with not having a sun blind is that in countries like ours where the weather is inclement and can change at any minute, we want the flexibility of being able to open and close the blind at will. Because when it's very bright outside, naturally there's a lot of light into the cabin, which feels nice, but that also means that whatever tint you have on the car suddenly becomes absolutely pointless because everyone can see in. Not great when you're parking the car somewhere in public and you may have valuables strewn about the cabin. On top of that, if, for example, it is a particularly hot day, that means that you have to go into the boot, take the sun blind out, fix it, and then hope that it stays sunny for the rest of the day because heaven forbid it becomes cloudy and you want to see the sky again. Well, tough. Now, with the front seat set up in my driving position, about 170 centimeters, as you can see, I have a decent amount of knee room and a pretty good amount of headroom despite the sloping roofline. That may be because there is no sunblind. But I will note that because this car has a longer wheelbase, that's why I have more legroom, but because this car is also lower, that means that I don't have that much space to tuck my feet in underneath the seat in front of me, which means that if you're particularly tall, you might want to pay attention to that. The floor in this car, however, is mercifully very flat, which means that if you need to put a center passenger in this seat, they should be relatively comfortable, although I wouldn't advise it for too long. Now, there are a pair of crotch coolers here, a USB-A and USB-C port underneath. I've got decently sized door bins, again big enough for a 1.5 litre size bottle. I've got pockets behind the front seats. There's also a little bit of ambient lighting on the backs of the seats, as well as Brabus badging up here, again to denote that you're in the faster model. And if I need more practicality, I have an armrest here with a couple of cup holders, which means that life back here is pretty comfortable indeed. Now, talking about the front seats, there are a couple of things that I forgot to mention earlier. Firstly, both of them are powered with lumbar support and ventilation, which means front seat passengers are very, very comfortable indeed. However, because of the design of the seats, it does mean that my visibility from here is kind of blocked. And so if the front passenger, for example, is sat at a slightly different angle, I might not be able to get a decent view out the gap between the seats. But at least the view out of this window is decently good. And of course, both of these rear seats come with ISOFIX mounts as well as the front passenger seat, which means that if you have a bulky rear-facing child seat, you can fit one in here without rubbing the back of the seat, or you can put it in the front seat instead in order to maximize legroom and increase, obviously, the versatility of the cabin. And of course, life back here is still decently comfortable like the rest of the car because the material quality is just as good as it is in the front. I've still got the microfiber material, as I mentioned, in the center of the seats. I've still got the red seat belts, again to denote that this is a performance vehicle. I've got all of that ambient lighting, and I still have illuminated tread plates as you would expect from a car pushing this amount of money. But of course, again, I can hear some of you saying that when you buy any car with a Brabus badge, practicality and space and stuff like that isn't exactly a primary consideration, because anything with a Brabus badge on it is solely, or at least almost solely, about the drive. And so you probably think I should be in the front seat talking about that, right? Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Smart #3 has these lovely, slightly sportier seats, as well as this microfiber wrapped steering wheel, at least for the #3 Brabus. And I will admit that that immediately gives you, again, a sense that you're in something that's a little bit more performance-oriented. But honestly, driving this car day to day is kind of where the #3 really shines. Because ultimately, that's what EVs do best, the daily grind, getting stuck in traffic and driving you to and from work. And in that regard, the #3 is actually pretty good. Because in addition to it being an electric vehicle and therefore not having any noise in terms of the powertrain, there's also the fact that this car comes as standard with level 2 at 2.5 actually, semi-autonomy, which means that as you drive along, you can just turn on the adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist and just enjoy the drive. And in doing so, that really does allow you to enjoy some of these cars' additional features like the Beats audio system, as well as the ventilated seats, all working to keep you in this lovely serene cocoon as you go back and forth. But I'll touch on the active safety systems a little bit later because, again, what you guys are most concerned about with this, a Brabus badged vehicle of any variety, is the way it drives. And so with that slightly sportier edge to it, Being sat here, again, when you're doing the daily grind, it might not be immediately obvious to you. The only thing that really stands out to me is the slightly harsher ride, because it's not uncomfortable, but it feels like there's a little bit more of an edge to this car. When you're going over things like expansion joints, etc., you will feel that this car's secondary ride, for example, works very hard in order to keep the car feeling very stable, very planted throughout, even when you're driving at lower speeds. But once the roads clear up and speeds pick up, that's when you really feel what's been done to this car in order to make it a more driver-focused experience. So for starters, that ride that I mentioned earlier suddenly comes good when the roads open up, because it does mean that the hashtag 3 feels like it just squats down and gets on with it. There's a huge amount of stability here, and it really feels like this car is hunkered down and gripping onto the road. Of course, aided by the fact this car also comes with all-wheel drive, which means that in terms of grip, you're never really lacking. And then of course there is the poke. This car has 543 Newton meters of torque, which means that getting up to motorway speeds is really a cinch. You never at any point feel like you're straining the car. And once you're there, you will enjoy the fact that because this car has a slightly lower and wider track compared to the hashtag 1, it means that high-speed stability is also much improved. Not that the hashtag 1 was bad in any way, but this car just feels a little bit better, which means that if you were to want to cover longer distances in this, especially over our motorway network, where there's lots of wide sweeping turns, in order for you to maintain that speed, this car will give you a degree more confidence. But to me, the real party trick in this car is actually when you turn off the motorway and you're on back roads. I say that because the hashtag 3 Brabus in particular, again, with that slightly revised ride as well as the very punchy, responsive powertrain, it just means that this car is so much fun to drive. You get immediate response from the throttle, the steering wheel weights up very naturally, and when you put it into Brabus mode, there's even a fake engine sound in order to sort of egg you on to drive faster. All of these things work very well together in order to create an environment where you just want to enjoy the road. And when you're going through those back roads, that's when you really appreciate, again, this car's dynamic edge. Because the steering wheel is not communicative in any way, shape or form, but at least because it's relatively thin-rimmed, you do get a pretty good grip on it. And so you do get some degree of feedback, but not that much. However, the seats are very communicative, which means that it will tell you when you're on the very edges of grip and what the chassis is doing, especially as you go over slightly badly paved roads, for example, in order for you to understand kind of how much grip there is in the car at any given time. And so that, to me, feels like a very positive experience. Now, bear in mind that other performance cars, if you will, within this segment, vehicles like the Golf GTI, etc., also suffer from the same issue, where your steering wheel, for example, is decidedly numb. And so to me, that doesn't feel like too much of a sore point. It more than makes up for it by simply being a really sorted chassis. This car has a very low center of gravity, as is expected with an EV. But on top of that, again, that stability, thanks to that wider, longer chassis, really does pay dividends both on the open road as well as on B roads. And then there's the safety systems. Told you I'd come back to that. So as I mentioned earlier, this car has a level 2.5 semi-autonomy system, which means that in addition to things like automatic emergency braking with pedestrian and cyclist detection, adaptive cruise control with traffic jam assist, blind spot monitoring, lane keep assist with lane departure warning, as well as a variety of other systems, that all that you'd expect from this class. You also have things like a lane change assistant, which is something that I've only seen in higher end BMWs. Again, in a car that does cost about ~250,000 ringgit, that is a pretty good deal. On top of that, there is also an eye tracking system in order to ensure that you are not tired behind the wheel, because if you are, the car will alert you and then suggest that you stop somewhere else, at least somewhere along your journey. And so that does mean that this car is very well equipped for money. However, this brings me on to some of the hashtag 3's downside. And these problems are not unique to the hashtag 3, because I've also raised these issues in the hashtag 1. So, for example, having to adjust any settings to do with the advanced driver assist systems requires you to go into the touchscreen. Now, I say that because this car does have a couple of very irritating features. Firstly is the speed limit warning, which is not just visual but also audible, which means that, for example, if it misreads the speed limit and on any given road because it is GPS linked. Like, for example, it has some misguided belief that the road in front of my condo is a strict 15 km/h zone, which it isn't. Which means that the moment you go past it, it starts beeping at you, and you have to disable that every time you get in the car. The same goes for what I find is perhaps the most irritating feature I've seen on a modern car yet, and that is the automatic speed limit adjustment. Now, this car comes with traffic sign recognition. This is par for the course for a car within this segment. However, what it also does is, in addition to reading traffic signs and also trying to figure out speed limits based on GPS data, if you set the cruise control to any reasonable speed, if it senses that that speed is above the prevailing speed limit, it will revise your cruise control downwards. Now, this is particularly annoying because I, when on motorways at least, prefer to set the cruise control at 110 km/h and just allow the car to adjust itself based on prevailing traffic conditions. For example, if you're going up and down the LDP or the Federal Highway, you will know that it is impossible to do 110 km/h because every other car will not be able to do 110 km/h. So the car will simply adjust itself based on the situation. But what the car does is, as it goes through slower portions and slower segments, it will lower that speed limit. And when you're stuck in traffic jams, you may not notice this. But as soon as the traffic speeds pick up, then you'll realize that you're sitting on the overtaking lane doing 60 km/h. And it doesn't let you know when that happens. It's only a visual warning, not an audible one. And so you may not notice that the speed limit on your adaptive cruise control has been changed. And most annoyingly, it only ever changes down, it doesn't go up. Which means that, for example, if you're leading up to a motorway and the speed limit at that point is, say, 60 km/h, then it will go down to 60. But then once you're, say, past the toll plaza and then the speed limits go up to 110, it just stays at 60, which means you're sat here adjusting the speed constantly, which I find really, really irritating. Now, again, you can disable that within the settings, but that is something you have to do every time you get in the car. On top of that, from, say, Android Auto, it requires 1, 2, 3, 4 taps in order to switch it off. And I just find that really, really annoying. There's no way to turn it into a shortcut either, because there is a shortcut option, or there are availabilities of shortcuts within the screen, but that's not an option. And so I find myself having to do that every time I get in the car, which I just find really, really annoying. And it does kind of spoil the experience of driving the #3 to me. But that aside, and these are, of course, changes that can be updated via an over-the-air software update, and I have raised this issue to ProNet before in the hopes that they will do something about it. But aside from that, the #3 does strike me as a very solid contender. This car drives well. To me, it looks good. It's got all the features that you expect from a premium electric vehicle. And given the fact that this car comes with a pretty solid and comprehensive warranty package, as well as a set of dealers that are linked up to Mercedes-Benz outlets, which means that you enjoy a very premium ownership experience, it does put a very good value proposition down. Now, if you look within this sort of price category, you also have vehicles like the BYD Seal, which offers perhaps a little bit more range, as well as the Volvo EX30, which also offers similar range and similar performance. In fact, the EX30 Ultra is a little bit faster to 100, but that is also a significantly smaller car, which means that ultimately there is some degree of compromise. There is also the incoming Zeekr X, which has not yet been launched, but to me, the first point of concern is the fact that Zeekr doesn't have an established dealer network, and its distributors in Malaysia are not established enough when it comes to dealing with premium mass market vehicles, which then raises the concerns of after-sales quality. Which means that unless you want a BYD Seal, which is perhaps one of the most popular vehicles within the sub 200,000 ringgit electric vehicle segment, basically this is it. The #3 is a little bit more expensive than even the most expensive BYD Seal, but there is very good reason for it. This is a premium machine with a premium badge on the front, and there is a clear focus on a premium ownership experience, which is something that BYD, for example, struggles to manage because it is ultimately a mass market brand. So if you ask me, the smart brand is certainly something that inspires confidence. The #3 is also a vehicle that inspires confidence, let alone this one with its Brabus badging and revised suspension. This is an excellent car, And throughout the period I've had it, I've had friends keep telling me that this is the sort of car that they could see me driving every day. And so if you are like me and you prefer an EV that can do a little bit of everything, then this might very well be the car for you. However, if you're looking at a car within this segment in order to cover motorway miles primarily, then you may be better served by a vehicle like the BYD Seal, especially in rear-wheel drive premium guise where you enjoy a significantly longer range as well as the ability to charge the car up to 100% every single time you plug it in. And then of course, if you prefer a premium experience, and you're not really all that fussed about space, then of course there is the Volvo EX30, a car that I liked quite a bit during my preview drive, and I look forward to testing that fully in due course. But the smart #3 Brabus is still a really solid package. You've got practicality, you've got performance, and you've got a fantastic interior and exterior design that will always turn heads. I love this car, and I'm certain that you will too. In any case, that has been our review of the smart #3 Brabus. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to be notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. We will catch you in the next one. Take care, stay safe, and jangan bodoh.